Mass graves are a global phenomenon identified in Chile, Spain, Korea, Rwanda, Bosnia, and many other countries. They are often the result of civil wars, military hunters, and totalitarian governments, but also from the aftermath of plagues and natural disasters such as the Bhattapola mass grave in Sri Lanka from the 2004 tsunami. A burial site is an active site of commemoration and memorialization of the deceased in a community. One is certain of who lies there for respects to be paid. A criminal mass grave exists as a burial site containing 3 or more victims of execution, although an exact definition is not unanimously agreed upon. The armed and unarmed conflicts in Sri Lanka is rife, with tensions, violence, disappearances and death persisting periods before and after the country's murky civil war. A mass grave is the abhorrent result of this violence and injustice that has been closely linked to disappearances, kidnappings, abductions, and extrajudicial killings in struggles between the state and its citizens. With this long-standing relationship of large-scale rooted violence and torture, it is difficult to know just how many mass graves exist in Sri Lanka.
There is an inherent relationship between mass graves and disappearances, but maybe to clarify that when we're talking about mass graves in this context, we're really referring to clandestine graves, where there could be even just 1 or 2 bodies which have not been identified, and so we don't know who exactly is in the grave and how they came to be here. The nature of disappearances are that one or a whole set of individuals have seemingly vanished into thin air after a particular point when they were last seen by an eyewitness, perhaps even a perpetrator. And so the whole point about mass graves is they offer the answers to what happened to these disappeared persons. And then you can work backwards as to how they were killed, when they were killed, and ultimately identify and prove there's this link between the disappeared and those bodies lying in the mass grave.
So a mass grave is a place where many people are buried at the same time, right? And mass graves arise usually during a disaster. Usually in ancient times, we talk about pandemics, we talk about floods. Those are moments when there are mass graves, when we don't have time to deal with each human remain as it is due to public health circumstances. The other known area of mass graves is mass graves arising out of conflict. In the last maybe 50 years, since the early 70s, we are also coming across the terrible thing of mass graves as a result of illegal or unlawful killings.
Enforced disappearances are an internationally recognized crime. There is a closely linked relationship between enforced disappearances and mass graves, the former being an instrumental characteristic of the latter. With only scattered assortments of evidence, it is almost impossible to identify who lies in a mass grave and how they came to be there. Mass graves are public secrets. Years of violence and state inaction in Sri Lanka gave way to at least 33 named mass grave sites that affect many different communities on the island. While some of the mass graves have been excavated and exhumed, most remain hidden. Understanding the facts surrounding each of these sites is the first step towards unearthing possible answers. How do we begin to unpack the existence of these sites? And what is the binding commonality between them? In 1994, the Sri Lankan government commissioned a Ceylon Electricity Board tower to be built on a hill in Suryakanda, close to Ambilipitiya. An anonymous witness contacted a journalist and local politician to reveal that a mass grave was located on this hill. With the support of the opposing party at the time, an unofficial team of media personnel visited the grave. When news of this spread, people and families flocked to the site in hopes to find any information or remains in their lifelong search for loved ones. This was the first mass grave excavation to officially take place in Sri Lanka. As this excavation was a result of spontaneity, many regularly followed procedures were not followed, damaging evidence and making identification impossible. Because of the lack of protection around the site, the investigation process was eventually abandoned. Today, this tower stands over the mass grave. The families of the disappeared are still waiting for answers. Municipal workers digging up the land on the Duriyappa Stadium in Jaffna that we know today uncovered human remains in 1999. Official excavations followed after an investigation started the same year. In this area, a combination of groups were in control during different periods of time between 1989 to 1995, including the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the LTT, and finally the Sri Lankan Army. The bodies have been suspected to be of Tamil victims killed during the occupation of the northern province by the Indian Peacekeeping Force in 1987. It's interesting to note that there was little community outreach to identify the bodies here, although the civil society group, University Teachers for Human Rights, actively opposed the lack of action. Although remains were sent to Colombo for identification, government officials stayed inactive. The site remains without commemoration, and families are still waiting for answers. In 2012, construction workers yet again found remains pertaining to a possible mass grave in central Sri Lanka, in the town of Matale. Forensic archaeologist Raj Somadeva dated the mass grave to contain remains of the disappeared from 1986 and 1990, linking it to the second JVP insurrection. Based on his findings, he concludes that dismemberment of human remains is the result of torture, decapitation, extreme violence, and concealment. By February 2013, the remains of more than 150 people had been excavated in the town of Matale in central Sri Lanka. Identified as a crime scene, it is now known as the largest mass grave site in the southern part of the country. Exhumation of this site led to official court proceedings, where witness testimonies were recorded. Today, a hospital stands over this site. The families are still waiting for answers.
ලංකාවේ ඉතිහාසය බලපුවාම බලය ලබා ගැනීම සඳහා මම කියන්නේ බලය වෙනස් කිරීම සඳහා කැරලි ප්‍රධාන වශයෙන් කැරලි තුනක් තිබුණා. 1971 1989 ඒ දෙකම දකුණේ ඊට පස්සේ උතුරු යුද්ධය අවුරුදු ගාණක් ගිය උතුරු යුද්ධය. අරගලයක් ආව නමුත් අපේ වාසනාවට අරගලයේ ආයුධ සන්නද්ධ දුන්නේ නැති නිසා මරණ සංඛ්‍යාවක් අපිට උනේ නැහැ. ඒතකොට මේ හැම කැරැල්ලෙදිම බලය ලබා ගන්න අනිත් පැත්තෙන් බලය රැක ගන්න එකිනෙකා මරා ගත්තා. මේ හැම කැරැල්ලකටම පස්සේ පැවතිච්ච ආණ්ඩු කොමිසම්පත් කරනවා. ඒපත් කරන්න වෙන මොකටවත් නෙමේ සිද්ධ වෙච්ච දේ හරියට දැනගෙන නැවත ආපසු මේක සිදුවීම වැළැක්වීම සඳහා. නමුත් 71 කොමිසමෙන් පස්සේ 89 කොමිසමෙන් පස්සේ සහ යුද්ධයේ උගත් පාඩම් සහ සංගීතය කොමිසම් වලින් පස්සේ මුකුත් උනේ නැහැ.
You take the person away, you start questioning them about a supposed crime. The person doesn't answer in the way you want them to answer. So then you torture them to try to get the information about this supposed crime. Technically, first of all, you cannot torture somebody. So any form of torture is a terrible wrong. But in addition, if the torture goes terribly wrong and the person is injured in a way that it's unlikely that the person would recover, then the authorities, the system that took that person into custody finds a way of disposing of that person, right? That is what we call a disappearance. So the connection, if you want to say, between a disappearance and a mass grave is when disappearances happen in a mass scale.
In Kalavanchikudi, approximately 100 Muslim people have been known to have disappeared, with 168 unidentified bodies in total. It is believed that on 12th July 1990, victims were taken captive and executed at the Kurukal Madam beach by a group of LTT cadres from Kalmune. Relatives of the victims claim they are buried on the beach. Given that the mass grave is located in a predominantly Tamil-inhabited area, the judge overlooking the case for excavation had postponed exhumations and further investigations until more dialogue between Tamil and Muslim communities happened to help gather information on the mass grave. However, at this time, investigations have still not taken place, and this site remains without commemoration. The families are still waiting for answers. Mannar contains multiple known mass graves. One was discovered in 2013 and another in 2018. In 2013, construction workers for the National Water Supply and Drainage Board uncovered skeletal remains next to the Tirukadiswaram village. Findings by the state-run archaeology department revealed that the bodies had been buried systematically, with no identifying clothes on the skeletal remains. Investigations were halted by 2014. According to human rights experts, the excavation methods used by the government possibly rendered meaningful forensic analysis impossible. Many problems were revealed during investigations, stating that the process of exhumation had not been conducted in an effective manner. This includes intimidatory tactics, threats, sexual abuse, and other forms of coercion or vigilance from some security and investigatory officers. This adds a complex layer of abuse families face in their search for truth. With the support of the Office of Missing Persons in discovering the other Mannar grave site in 2018, revelations showed the site contained over 300 skeletons. The families of the disappeared in Mannar are still waiting for answers. While on trial for the rape and murder of Krishanti Kumaraswamy, a former Sri Lankan army officer and his indicted co-defendants testified to the existence of 27 known mass graves in the northern area, containing over 300 bodies. This happened around the time that the Sri Lankan security forces recaptured the Jaffna Peninsula in 1996. Among these named sites was Chemmani. In 1997, The location garnered a lot of international attention after a push from Amnesty International for exhumation to keep with international standards in collecting evidence. As a result, 15 bodies were identified to be of disappeared persons from Jaffna in 1996. Soon after, 5 of the 9 soldiers identified 16 different sites with 150 bodies buried in the Chemani area on orders from their superiors. Now there are reports of over 300 bodies being buried here. Families of the disappeared have a right to the truth on what happened to their loved ones. However, ascertaining this truth is an overshadowing challenge due to the state's disinterest, obstruction of investigations, and gradual erasure of the lost.
So when families are dealing with loss, and specifically ambiguous loss, it actually complicates the entire grieving process, because ambiguous loss is essentially a situation where there are no clear facts surrounding a person who is no longer there. So when somebody dies, however hard that is, we can still make sense of what has happened, even a sudden death. But if somebody just disappears, then we cannot make sense of that event. And there are then none of the usual sort of trappings, none of the rituals that follow a death. None of those are there. So it makes it then very difficult for family members to actually even know how to process what has happened. So, ambiguous loss of this type, where it's defined as somebody who is physically absent but is psychologically still present. And that's one of the hardest things. I personally do not use the word closure, or I try not to use the word closure when it comes to the grieving process, because grieving is not a linear experience. There is no timeline to it. There is no point at which a family member can say that this is it, I've reached the end of the road here. That doesn't happen. We never stop grieving for people that we truly love. So it's more about trying to sort of live with that loss. And I think we all become gradually just better at managing what has happened. But where there is no explanation, where you do not know for certain that a loved one is really gone forever, that processing just doesn't happen in the same way. So it becomes what we would call complicated grief. And I think, for families, this is something they will struggle with for the longest time.
அம்மா இந்த கதை எங்களுக்கு சொல்ல சம்பந்தமா?
நான் சொல்லுவேன்.
சரி. கொன்னம் உங்களோட கணவன் ஹஸ்பண்ட் காணாமல் போனதை பற்றி சொல்லுங்கம்மா.
அவர் 85ஆம் ஆண்டு தனிதா மாட்டுக்கு போனவர் இல்லையே.
சரி.
போன வாப்பா இல்லை. 85ஆம் ஆண்டு 10ஆம் மாதம் 22ஆம் தேதி போன வாப்பா புதன்கிழமை. அப்போ போனவர் அப்பா இல்லை. அதோட நாங்கள் 3 நாள் மட்டும் தேடினேன். ஆள் இல்லை, எந்த தகவலும் இல்லை. இதுவரையிலே நாங்கள் ஜனசாகம் கண்டுபிடிக்கல. ஆள்ற என்ன நடந்துன்னு தெரியும் எங்களுக்கு.
ඒ කාලේ අවුරුදු 22කින් මම වෙන්නේ අපි ඒ ගල් රස්සාව තමයි කරේ. ඒ ගල් වලේ වැඩ කරන ගමන් තමයි මෙයා යාළු වුනේ. යාළුනේ කියන්නේ ඒගොල්ලන්ගේ අක්කලා එහෙම විහිළුවට වගේ මේක යෝජනා කළා තමයි දෙන්න යාළු වුණා. ඊපස්සේ අපේ ගෙදරින් කැමති වුණේ නැහැ. කැමති වුණේ අයියා කෙනෙක් හිටියා. අයියා මට හොඳටම ගැහුවා. ගැහුවාම මෙයා කිව්වා එයත් එක්ක යන් කියලා. ඊට පස්සේ එයත් එක්ක ගියා. ගිහිල්ලා වෙලා ඒගොල්ලන් එකතු කරලා පස්සේ කසාල් බැන්දෙව්වා. ඊට පස්සේ තමයි ඉතින් අපි මේ වත්තට ඇවිල්ලා පොඩි ගයක් හදාගෙන කොහොම හරි ඉතින් අවුරුදු 9යි එයත් එක්ක පවුල් කෑවේ. 79 වෙනිදා 89 වෙනකොට ඔක්කොම ඉවරයි.
இந்த பிள்ளை இந்த மருமகளும் 2009 5ஆம் மாதம் 18ஆம் தேதி வட்டுவாயலுக்கு இப்படி போகிறேன்னு வட்டுவாயலை வச்சு ஒரு 50-60 பேரோட உண்டாவே சரணடைஞ்சவன். அது ஏற்றி கொண்டு போன பிறகு நாங்கள் இன்று வரைக்கும் எங்கேன்னு இந்த பிள்ளை தெரியாது. அப்போ நாங்கள் இங்கே இருக்க எனக்கு ஓமந்தையில் கண்டேன்னு ஆக்கள் சொன்னது கொண்டு வச்சுருந்தா அவன் ஒரு பஸ்ஸில் ஏற்றி கொண்டு போனதான் தனியை. அப்போ ஏற்றி கொண்டு போனேன். அப்போ இப்போ ஒரு பேர் பட்டியலும் இல்லை, ஒன்றும் இல்லை. இந்த பிள்ளை காணாமல் போகலை. உங்களோட கையில் கொடுத்த பிள்ளைகள் அதுகளை என்ன அதுகளை எங்கள் நீ வச்சிரு இருக்கின்ற இடத்த எங்களுக்கு சொல்லுங்க. நாங்கள் இப்படி அதாவது இந்த பிள்ளை இருக்கின்ற ஒரு சந்தோஷத்தில் இருப்பேன்.
So since the end of the war, I think family members have waged one of the most powerful and one of the longest struggles for truth and justice, I think, in Sri Lanka. Even today, so almost how many years after the war? 13 years after the war, almost every week, I think, there's a protest, right, that is organized by family members. And through these protests, they are making the disappeared visible, and they're also expressing very clearly what they want from the state. What they want is first to know what happened to their family members. And so therefore, they have refused to take compensation from the state. They have refused to register the disappeared as dead, which is, as kind of justice. This is what the state is offering them. And again, through surveillance, through intimidation, they are continuing these protests. And I think the point is the Sri Lankan state, despite all of these commissions they've appointed and despite the Office on Missing Persons, they're refusing to simply listen and tell these families what has happened. So I think until the Sri Lankan state is willing to deliver on the question of truth, these protests will continue. And as you know, I think now family members are saying they have no faith that the Sri Lankan state will deliver justice or even truth, and they are demanding truth and justice from the international community.
99% of the investigations in Sri Lanka fail to meet family members' needs or satisfactions because of the crucial lack of skills, expertise, cooperation, and accountability on the part of the government.
I believe what the Sri Lankan government should do is to strengthen the mechanisms relating to the missing. And I want to make it very clear that addressing the issue of the missing is not closing files and not just saying that the files are concluded, but rather to provide answers to the families of the missing. And there, I think the Sri Lankan government has to operationalize these institutions, has to strengthen their institutions, ensure that the people appointed to those institutions understand the objective of those of such institutions.
මේ අයගේ එයාලා කැරලිකාරයෝ වෙන්න පුළුවන්, ඒකේ ආණ්ඩුවේ සහයෝග දක්වන අය වෙන්න පුළුවන්, එහෙම නැත්නම් හමුදාවේ පොලිසිය වෙන්න පුළුවන්. නමුත් මේ අයගේ ජීවිත නැති වෙච්චාම, ඝාතනය වුණාම, අතුරුදහන් වුණාම ඒ පවුල් වල අයට එන කඳුළු එක සමානයි.
සමූහ මිනිවලක් කියන එකම මේ රටේ අතුරුදහන් වුවන් එක්ක බැඳිච්ච කතාවක්. කොහොම කළත් මේ රටේ කොතනක හරි සමූහ මිනිවලක් බතු වෙනවාද පැහැදිලිවම ඒ මිනිවල මේ රටේ අතුරුදහන් වුවන් එක්ක බද්ධ වෙච්ච සංසිද්ධියක්.
நாங்கள் கொடுத்தது எங்களோட உறவுகள், எங்களோட பிள்ளைகள். நாங்கள் 10 மாதம் சுமந்து பெற்று 18-19 வயது வரையும் படுத்து இவர்களிடம் கொடுத்து விட்டு இன்றைக்கு 13 வருடங்களாக நாங்கள் எங்களோட உறவுகளை தேடி நிற்கின்றோம். ஆனால் இவர்கள் அந்த எங்களோட உறவுகளுக்கு மறுபடி சொல்ல மாட்டார்கள். சர்வதேசம்தான் எங்களுக்கு இந்த நீதியை பெற்று தர வேண்டும் என்று நாங்கள் எந்த சர்வதேசத்திடமே நாங்கள் மன்றாட்டமாக கேட்டு நிற்கின்றோம்.
ඉදිරියට කියන්නේ ඉතින් අපිට වන්දියක් ඉල්ලලා තමයි කියන්නේ. වන්දියක් කියන්නේ ඒගොල්ලෝ ලක්ෂ දෙකක්ද කොහෙද දෙනවා කියලා කියන්නේ. ලක්ෂ දෙකද මිනිස්සෙක් වටින්නේ. මිනිස්සුන්ට මොකද උනේ කියලාවත් අද වෙනකන් ඒගොල්ලෝ කියන්නේ නැහැ.
எங்கள் பிள்ளை எங்கே கொண்டு வச்சிருக்காங்கன்னு தெரியல. நான் வேற உண்டு எங்களுக்கு ஒன்றுமே வேண்டாம். பிள்ளைகளுக்கு இனிமேல் காசு தான். எங்களுக்கு என்னத்துக்கு காசு? என் பிள்ளை இருந்தால் எனக்கு எவ்வளோ பெருமதி. எனக்கு எங்களுக்கு ஒரு கதையும் வேணாம். எங்களோட பிள்ளைகள் எங்களுக்கு என்ன முடிவு சொல்ல வேணும். எங்களுக்கு கொண்டு போகணும். நீங்கள் எங்கே வச்சிருக்கீங்க, என்ன நடந்தது, அதைத்தான் நாங்கள் கேட்குறோம். அன்றைக்கு இங்கேருந்து நாங்கள் ஜனாதிபதியை பார்க்க போனோம். நாங்கள் அவரை வேற ஒன்றும் செய்ய போகலை. எங்களை அடித்து எங்களை துன்புறுத்தி வாகனத்தில் ஏற்றி சப்பாத்தால் அடித்து எங்களை இவ்வளோ சித்திரவதை செய்தாங்க. நாங்கள் என்ன கேட்டோம்? நாங்கள் எங்களோட பிள்ளைகளை எங்கேன்னு கேட்கத்தானே போனோம். எங்களுக்கு அப்படி போய் எங்களுக்கு அந்த மாதிரி சித்திரவதை செய்கிறாங்க. இதுக்கெல்லாம் எங்களுக்கு ஒரு நீதி தேடி தாங்க. அப்படி தாங்க, வேற ஒன்றும் கேட்க இல்லை.
Investigations and excavations are a difficult process for many families. However, they carry the potential to provide closure and end the cycle of trauma. It is a chance to ensure family members are not living with an open wound. This erasure continues when strategic development projects are built over the sites of mass graves. Electrical towers, hospitals, and stadiums are purposeful facilities in a community which further complicate the call to action for investigations and excavations. In Sri Lanka, we see a pattern of suppression, violence, and silencing from the government onto our people. How do we end this pattern and begin on a path towards generational reparation, accountability, justice, and closure for the affected?